The rise and fall of the Japanese Empire. Japan's story isn't just one of emperors, samurais, and ancient traditions. It's also a tale of rapid transformation, military conquest, and ultimate defeat. How did a small island nation rise to become one of the most powerful empires in modern history, only to crumble in the face of war? Let's dive into the fascinating journey of the Japanese Empire. The dawn of the empire. A nation. Awakens for centuries, Japan was a land of samurai, feudal lords, and an emperor who held divine status. The country was isolated from the world, following a strict policy called sakoku, basically a closed country policy that limited contact with outsiders. While Europe was conquering lands and expanding empires, Japan remained locked away, untouched by Western influence. That all changed in 1853 when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived from the US with steam-powered warships, forcing Japan to open its doors to trade. This moment was a wake-up call. Japan realized that if it didn't modernize, it would end up like China, which had been humiliated by Western powers during the Opium Wars. So, in 1868, Japan underwent a complete transformation, the Meiji Restoration. The old feudal system was abolished, the emperor was restored to real power, and the country rapidly industrialized. In just a few decades, Japan built railroads, modernized its military, and embraced Western technology. They went from samurai swords to rifles, from wooden ships to steel battleships. Japan was no longer a medieval state, it was becoming a rising empire. Expansion and war. Japan becomes a superpower. Japan's ambition quickly grew beyond its borders. The empire's leaders saw that European powers were carving up Asia, and they wanted a piece of the action. First, they targeted Korea. In 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War, taking control of Taiwan and making Korea its puppet state. 2. Then, they shocked the world by defeating Russia. In 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, Japan crushed the Russian Navy, proving that an Asian power could beat a European giant. This was unheard of at the time. 3 by World War I, Japan had joined the Allies and expanded further, taking German colonies in the Pacific. Japan was now a major power, but they had an even bigger goal, dominating all of Asia. World War II, the empire overreaches. By the 1930s, Japan's hunger for land grew even more. They invaded Manchuria in 1931, then China in 1937, launching the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War. The world condemned Japan, but no one stopped them. Then came the decision that would change history, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan, believing it had no choice but to strike first, launched a surprise attack on the US, dragging America into World War II. At first, Japan was unstoppable. They conquered the Philippines, Indonesia, and much of Southeast Asia in just a few months. Their empire stretched from China to the Pacific, but then the tides turned. The US, with its massive industrial power, began pushing Japan back. After brutal battles like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima, the empire was on its last legs. Finally, in 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. The mighty empire was no more. The aftermath. From defeat to economic powerhouse. Japan was devastated, cities in ruins, economy shattered. But in one of history's greatest comebacks, Japan reinvented itself. With American help, they rebuilt their country, focusing on technology, industry, and innovation. By the 1980s, Japan wasn't an empire anymore, but it was an economic superpower, producing cars, electronics, and leading the world in tech. Today, Japan is known for its culture, technology, and economy, not military conquest. But the story of its empire, how it rose so fast and fell so hard, remains one of the most fascinating chapters in history. History turned Japan from an empire into a peaceful nation. But in an alternate timeline, the Japanese Empire could have reshaped the entire world. What if Japan had never lost World War II? Imagine a world where Japan didn't surrender in 1945. Instead of the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki leading to their unconditional surrender, what if Japan had managed to negotiate a peace deal or even hold on to its conquered territories? How different would our world be today? To fully grasp this alternate reality, we need to consider several key factors: Japan's military strategy, its resources, global politics, and how the United States and its allies would have responded to a prolonged Japanese resistance. Japan's strengths and strategic position. By 1941, Japan had built a powerful empire across Asia. They controlled large parts of China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Their navy was among the most advanced in the world, and their military was feared for its discipline and resilience. Even though they were stretched thin by the time the war was turning against them, they still had a formidable force. Had Japan chosen a different strategy, perhaps fortifying its defensive positions instead of engaging in reckless expansion, it might have forced the US and its allies into a negotiated peace. If Japan had maintained control over key regions like Manchuria, Korea, and parts of China, they could have remained a dominant force in Asia. Avoiding surrender, possible outcomes. If Japan had not surrendered in 1945, several things could have happened. A negotiated peace deal. Instead of facing total defeat, Japan could have sought a ceasefire. If Germany had fallen and the US was unwilling to commit to a prolonged war in Asia, Japan might have retained parts of its empire in exchange for peace. This would mean a very different map of Asia today. Korea might still be under Japanese control, China might have remained divided, and the Cold War could have played out very differently. A prolonged war. If Japan had chosen to fight on, the US would have likely launched a full-scale invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall. This would have resulted in catastrophic losses for both sides, possibly leading to even harsher post-war conditions for Japan. The Soviet Union, which declared war on Japan in August 1945, would have invaded northern Japan. This could have resulted in Japan being divided, similar to how Germany was split into East and West. Japan as a major power today. If Japan had managed to hold on to parts of its empire, it would have remained a dominant military and economic force in Asia. The Cold War might have had a three-way rivalry: the US, the Soviet Union, and an imperial Japan. China's rise might have been significantly delayed or even prevented, as Japan would have continued its occupation. Korea would likely not be divided into North and South, but instead remain under Japanese rule. Impact on the modern world. In a world where Japan never fully lost the war, we would see a stronger and more aggressive Japan in global politics, possibly acting as a counterbalance to US and Chinese influence. A more militarized Asia, with nations like China and Korea forced to remain in a state of resistance or subjugation. A very different global economy, with Japan maintaining control over key industries and resources in Southeast Asia. Would Japan still be an ally of the US today, or would it have become a long-term rival like China? Would it have maintained its authoritarian rule, or eventually transitioned into a democracy like post-war Germany? These are the questions that shape this alternate history. In the end, the reality of World War II led Japan to reinvent itself as a peaceful economic superpower. But had things gone differently, we might be living in a world where Japan was still an empire, one that never lost its ambition to dominate Asia.